Good morning, and thank you for joining me for our Sunday reads in honor of Maritime Month. The Oak Bluffs Library is celebrating its 4th annual Maritime Month in honor of Gordon Goodwin, whose family donated a generous fund to the library so that we could celebrate maritime culture and history on the vineyard. My name is Nina Ferry, and I am the Reference Librarian at Oak Bluffs Library. This morning, I will be reading to you from a book called In Danger at Sea, Adventures of a New England Fishing Family by Captain Samuel S. Cottle. Although this book does not take place on Martha's Vineyard, it does take place off the southeastern coast of Rhode Island at a place called Point Judith. Sam's grandfather, Capt, single-handedly created that port, very similar to many families here on the vineyard who put in fish markets and have long-time traditions of fishing and lobstering on the vineyard. If you would like to reserve any of these books, please give the library a call and we can pull them off the shelf for you. Alternately, you can search online in our catalog and we will be happy to pull them for curbside pickup. This first chapter in the captain's log is called Mayday, Mayday. In years past, commercial fishing vessels were registered with the United States government. Once this happened, usually at the U.S. Customs House, they technically became the property of the government. In the event of a marine casualty, i.e. the sinking of a vessel, the captain or owner was responsible to report in detail how the loss occurred and in particular to provide information as to the welfare of the crew. On October 3rd, 1956, I was obligated to submit the following. To Lester W. Raines, Commander USCG, Senior Investigating Officer of Marine Inspection. Oil School, Roberta D., official number 250197, Marine Casualty, September 26, 1956, 12:54 a.m. Dear Commander Raines, in compliance with Coast Guard regulations in reporting a marine casualty, I submit the following report on the loss of the fishing vessel Roberta D. We had finished our last tow south of Martha's Vineyard in 30 fathoms of water and had just hauled in the trawl doors and secured the net and other gear. Then the crew began to put the fish below into the fish hold. I set a course for Point Judith, put the boat on autopilot, and went to help the crew clean up. The wind was beginning to freshen out of the northeast, and the visibility at the time was about 15 to 20 miles. We were full to the hatches, and they were secured for foul weather. I set a 2-hour watch for each of the crew, Norm Gilbert, Maurice Morse, and his brother Don Morse. Don was to be the last man on watch, and he was to call me when we got to Whistle Buoy R2, just south of Point Judith. I then turned in for the night. Maurice, also known as Mo, was near the end of his watch, and his brother Don was in the wheelhouse with him, finishing a cup of coffee. As required, Mo was to check everything on deck as well as in the engine room before turning the watch over to the next man. On the Roberta D, the engine room companionway was about 10 feet aft of the wheelhouse. As Mo went below decks, he discovered seawater nearly up to the engine room floor. The wind was now blowing at about 20 knots out of the northeast, and visibility was down to 8 or 10 miles. Don came down to my stateroom and woke me, saying that we were making water real bad. I immediately went on deck and down to the engine room. Water was now over the floor. We had two 2.5-inch pumps on each engine, and those gave us the capacity of pumping 10 inches of water in a continuous stream. I had Don check the hose outlets to see if both pumps were working, and they were. I then asked Mo to wake Norm, who was sleeping in the forecastle. While he was doing that, I called the Coast Guard on channel 2182 to advise them of our situation. I provided cross bearings from our Lauren and told them that I was changing course from our original destination of Point Judith to Block Island, as it was about 15 miles closer. I was hoping to make Old Harbor on the east side of the island. At that moment, I did not think we were sinking, but I was not going to take any chances. I couldn't believe that a 10-inch stream of water would not keep up with the problem, so I sent Mo and Dawn into the engine room to check the belts and the pumps, and also asked them to find out where the water was coming from. All pipes running from the engine's cooling system to the outside hull seacocks were intact. There were no obvious explosions of seawater from under or around the engines, as it would be if there were a breach in the hull and it was in the engine room. Mo and Dawn came back with the report that the great flood of water was coming from the fuel tank compartment. The Roberta D was a converted subchaser built in 1941 at the outbreak of World War II. She had a separate fuel compartment with a bulkhead aft of the crew's quarters and officers' staterooms, and it contained bronze fuel tanks about 10 feet long. These ran from the keel to the deck above, from the side to side inside the hull. The bulkhead forward was watertight, as it had remained intact since the time of the vessel's construction. The after bulkhead, though, had been compromised. A section had been removed when the original engines that the Navy had installed were taken out. New GM engines were put in their place when the vessel was converted for fishing. A section of the bulkhead had been left out to allow access to the fuel tanks for the new engines. It was from there that the cold Atlantic was pouring into the engine room. As we steamed toward home that night, we must have struck a submerged object, a log or a tree stump, something big enough to punch a hole in the hull under the tank compartment. With a hold full of fish, and with sea conditions as they were, we could strike such an object and not feel the impact. I put out a mayday call on the emergency channel, as well as the channel used by fishermen. The fishing boat Our Gang out of Stonington, Connecticut was just off Point Judith, heading in through the East Gap in the breakwater, when she responded. Sammy Roderick's voice, conditioned by cigarette smoke and whiskey, was as raspy as sandpaper on a schoolhouse blackboard, but it sounded heavenly to me at the moment. "What the hell's going on, and where are you to?" I gave him my location and asked if he would be willing to put me under tow if I was able to get to him in time. He said he would, that he was swinging off now to intercept me at Block Island, and he would have his crew rig up a towing cable for us. What I had in mind was this. The Roberta D was sinking, but if we could get her cable to her before she went down and could get her underway, there was a very good chance we could keep her going just below the surface until we got into shallow water. In such an event, we would be able to raise her before the winter storms hit. About that time, Norman ran into the wheelhouse to say that a steamer was heading more or less our way. I told him to get out the flare gun and fire one so it would cross the skipper's line of sight. He did so, and within a few moments we could see the change in the steamer's course. She was apparently coming out of New York, heading east toward the Nantucket Lightship before setting off for Europe. I had Norm fire another flare, and had Mo light a stationary flare and put it on top of the wheelhouse so it could easily be seen. This done, I was sure that the steamer would be alongside us in just minutes. Then we saw the ship turn to starboard, returning to her original course. We couldn't believe it. She was going to ignore a Mayday distress call, flares, and our deck lights on, all of which clearly showed that we were a vessel in distress, not some figment of a lookout's imagination. I called every channel on our radio, screaming for assistance, all to no avail. The steamer sailed by us, and then beyond us, and then out of sight to the eastward. There was nothing left to do but concentrate on things that were within our ability to control. Even though the engine room was rapidly filling with water, both engines kept running and generators kept producing electricity for the deck lights, the lights in the wheelhouse, and our lifeline to help, the radio. As long as those engines were running, we maintained headway toward Block Island, looking for some sign of assistance from Our Gang and/or the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard station was located in New Harbor, on the west side of Block Island. It was in constant contact with us. They had dispatched a 40-footer, a very tough steel picket boat, but the crew had to go around Sandy Point on the north end of the island before they could turn in a southeasterly direction toward us. I certainly hoped they would make it in time. The R gang was full of fish and was slow making headway in our direction. Yet she had the advantage of being able to head in straight line of our coordinates. At first, I was hoping that the R gang would arrive before the picket boat, as I wanted desperately to save the Roberta Lee, if possible. Throughout this book, there are pictures from the author and also drawings. This drawing is of that boat, the Roberta D. As the situation worsened, I didn't really care who got to us first, as long as they arrived before we went down. The Coast Guard told me that a plane had been sent to the scene from their New England headquarters in Massachusetts, and that we would be seeing it shortly. This was no sooner said than the ocean around us lit up like New York City. It was a PV-2B just overhead, and the crew had put on their landing lights. They were in radio contact with the picket boat that was on the way, but I was unable to talk with the plane. I did advise the plane crew via the picket boat that we were in no need of rubber rafts, as our dory was on deck and ready to be used if need be. They advised us that they would circle overhead until help arrived. If it arrives, I thought to myself. Suddenly, an engine stopped. As it did, water spewed out of the exhaust pipe. The engine was blown for sure. Now, with 2 pumps out of service, the flooding engine room caused the boat to list starboard, the side with the heavy gallus frames and the drag gear. Things were getting a bit dicey. I knew that we would have to put the dory overboard, but I didn't want to do so until we could see the lights of either of the 2 boats heading our way. A dory is a great little seaboat, but that's with 1 or 2 men in it. This dory would have to carry 4 men and would be launched into a stiff northeast wind with rough seas and poor visibility. Not a good situation at best, deadliest at worst. Even if the plane dropped a raft, there was no way we could get into it given the sea conditions. Our best bet was to stick with the dory. Next, 2 events happened within minutes of each other. Norman came into the wheelhouse to tell me that the second engine was nearly covered with seawater, and only the air intake was still clear, which meant that it would be stopping soon. Then, Don hollered that he could see the lights just inshore on us. I had Norm fire off a flare and called into the radio, "Do you see our flare?" The chief petty officer on the picket boat said that they did, and they would be alongside in 10 minutes or so. I ordered my men into the dory and told them to get it away from the Roberta D to prevent any possibility of its becoming trapped in the rigging or the fishing gear or the vortex when she went down. When they were safely away, I called to the Coast Guard to advise them of the situation. I told them that I was leaving the wheelhouse and the radio and would be on the flying bridge. From the bridge, I watched my crew being picked up by the picket boat and was greatly relieved for them. I had not wanted to be the one to tell their wives that they were lost. Then I began to hear some wicked noise from the one operating engine, and I knew it would stop momentarily. I also knew that the minute the Roberta D lost headway, she was bound for Davy Jones's locker, and I was not keen on going with her. Just as the engine blew, the chief ran the picket boat up the deeply sloped deck of the sinking Roberta D, right to the flying bridge, and I stepped onto his deck without getting my feet wet. As soon as I had joined my crew in the cockpit, the chief yelled, "There she goes!" We turned to look, and the picket boat's spotlight lit up the Roberta D's forward deck as my first command started to settle into the ocean. She raised her bow high, with all the remaining air moving forward below decks, and the deck plate on the chain locker in the bow blew off with an explosion that flew through foamy seawater 100 feet into the air. Then she slid quietly, stern first, beneath the heavy seas, until she disappeared from view. I will never forget that sight or that feeling. What I had worked so hard to acquire, my very first dragger, had been lost so suddenly. The chief told us to go below, buckle up the seatbelts, and sit tight as we were in for a rough 2-hour ride to Point Judith. I never knew a boat to have seatbelts, but after that ride, I definitely knew why this one had them. We were quartering the sea as we headed into port, and every few seconds, that little picket boat and the 40-footer, that was small for the job she had to do, would become airborne. If we had not been secured in those belts, we would have been smashed against the overhead. When she dove into a trough, the reverse would have taken place. That ride home, as appreciated as it was, took more out of me and my crew than all of the events we had just gone through. My hat is off to the Coast Guardsmen. Their role as guardians of the seas is no small one, and sadly it is often little appreciated by those going down in the sea in ships. The chief petty officer kindly called our gang, which was just coming into sight, to advise Sammy Roderick of the situation. Ours was a sad return to Point Judith, but at least it was a return. This, Commander Rains, completes the report to the best of my recollection and ability to record it. Please extend to the men at Block Island and the air crew in Massachusetts my sincere well done. Respectfully submitted, Samuel S. Cottle, Jr., Captain Roberta D., Galilee, Rhode Island. That concludes the first chapter of this book. And if you would like to hear excerpts from other books in our maritime collection, grab a cup of joe and join one of our staff members next Sunday as we read to you from these faded sea tales. Enjoy that wonderful day, and if you have a chance, get out onto the beach, the ocean, get into a boat, enjoy those last September days at the beach, and celebrate our maritime community, just as Gordon Goodwin would have. Thanks for listening.